Hi. The Common Core standards are about 6 years old. It's about the same age as the Hechinger report. And today we're going to talk about Common Core, how it's been received around the country, what changes it's undergoing, and the future. And in all the time I've been reporting on and editing stories about Common Core for the last 6 years or so, I've learned that the standards are a little boring. But classrooms and the way we try to tell stories about the standards is by getting into classrooms and really looking at what's happening with kids and teachers. And so today what we're going to do is turn this auditorium into a classroom for just a few minutes and really try to understand what it's like to be a kid and a teacher. So imagine you're 8 years old. You're getting a little hungry for lunch. It's still a long time away. And here's your teacher, Ms. Ponce. She's going to make you sit through a math lesson before you get to lunch. But fortunately for us, she's a really good teacher, and she's going to go stand at the podium. And I'd like you all to take your pencils out, sit up straight. Eyes on Ms. Ponce, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm excited to be here today. I started my teaching career several years prior to DC's implementation of the Common Core state standards. And since their implementation, my instruction has changed, especially around math instruction. That's my focus this year. And one way that it's really changed is in terms of rigor. And when I say rigor, I don't mean that one set of standards is harder than another set of standards or more difficult, but really looking at how thorough and accurate the standards are at teaching the content. And so I'd like to focus on that idea as we put on our third grade hats today and talk a little bit about math. And so DC had its own standards prior to the Common Core. And so if you're a third grader, this was one of the standards that you were asked to work on. And in this standard, you as a third grader need to know your multiplication facts through 10 times 10, and then use those facts as a specific strategy to solve related problems. So in this example, what is 30 times 50? You all probably know that 3 times 5 is 15. And so then you're able to use that basic fact to know that 3 times 50 will be 150. Some of you might use the standard algorithm to figure that out. Some of you might be familiar with multiplying by multiples of 10 and say to yourself, well, 3 times 5 is 15, so I'm just going to add a 0 at the end. It's a very procedural standard, and our standards before the Common Core were heavy on procedure. And some students may even just memorize, well, I'm just going to write a 0 at the end. And as a teacher, I know that memorization doesn't always mean understanding. And so this is a Common Core standard that I work on with my third graders this year. And so as third graders, you're really focusing now on multiplying a one-digit number by multiples of 10. But this time, it's not just one strategy that we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on multiple strategies based on all of your prior learning on the place value system and properties of operation. And so in this sample problem, students aren't even asked to find the solution, the product of 7 times 40, though they might know. They're asked to think about that multiplication in a deeper way and play around with it a little bit. So seeing that 7 times 40, some of you might think, well, that's really saying 7 groups of 4 tens, and that could be a way that you go about solving the problem. But then others could think, well, 40 is a big number. I'm going to decompose that. I'm going to think of that as 4 groups of 10, because I really like multiplying by the number 10. So 7 times 4 times 10 could also be a strategy to getting a correct answer. And so the implication for my work as a teacher is really thinking not just about the procedural understanding, because it's still important for students to know how to do the math, but also thinking about how I can best structure my teaching to make sure students are able to do the math, to understand why the math works, and then also to understand different contexts that it can be presented in. And so that's how the Common Core standards have changed my instruction in my classroom, and I'm excited to talk more with the panel today.
Thank you. So Liana, tell us a little bit, you're working with teachers. What has been the biggest struggle for those teachers as they've shifted over to this kind of more complicated teaching?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and I think I heard someone mention it in a previous panel, is you're almost relinquishing a little bit more control of the direct teaching. So it's asking to put students and their thinking front and center in those classroom discussions, which is more nuanced and I think a little bit more challenging.
What about the kids? Are they struggling? There's been some concern that some of the standards, especially at the lower grades, are not developmentally appropriate. What have you seen?
From what I've seen, we've been really focused on building students up to be able to think about their own thinking. And so from my experience, students get really excited about defending their own work and explaining like what they did and why they did it. And it's hard at first for students to do that. They have to get used to that process because it's not necessarily something that they've done in the past.
Mm-hmm. Kimberly, I want to put a question to you. One of the issues that the standards have faced have been parents getting homework home that they don't understand. A lot of upset parents, putting stuff on Facebook and so on. What would you say to parents who are disgruntled about the standards?
I think that it's really important. In New Jersey, we've done a lot of work at the state level supporting our educators in districts as they support parents and community members and bringing them in as partners in the instructional process, really working with them to understand, because it is a big change. I have 2 children. Things are not the same as when I went to school, thank goodness, because we don't have a card catalog and they don't have to wait online for an encyclopedia or to get information. It's right at hand. And so as parents, sometimes it's hard for us when the learning doesn't look like it looked for us, but our children are learning in a different environment. So we work really hard to engage parents in the conversation so that they don't feel outside or like we're trying to work with their children without them. And so really creating partnerships around instruction consistently in our districts.
Mm-hmm. And New Jersey's interesting. You're one of those states that did a review of the Common Core, came up with your own new standards with a new name. But the standards turn out to have 84% of the same content as the Common Core. So I want you to talk about some specific examples of things that you changed and why.
Sure, and I think it's important to put that into context because when New Jersey's had really high standards for over 20 years, so when we moved from our New Jersey core curriculum content standards and incorporated the Common Core for mathematics and English language arts, again, we only saw about a 16 to 20% change for us, and that leads me to say that I think there's a consistency across states and across standards of what we see in general in classroom instruction. A few examples, we saw some grade changes that are significant, especially around literacy. Our previous core curriculum content standards, we had a very strong focus on important skills, especially for young children in early literacy, where they learn to make connections to the text, but also to themselves and to the world around them. And in the Common Core, there was a great focus on sort of cold reading and coming to a text and sort of forgetting about those pieces, especially in young children. And so our educators, when they did the review, really felt strongly that that's an important skill in early literacy. And then we also saw a change, for example, in our upper grades, where there are times when we're reading a text where there are things that are left uncertain. There's something that's not known, and we have to bring our own information to it. And those skills are not taught until 11th and 12th grade in our previous standards. And in our revisions, our educators really felt strongly that specific standard be brought down into 9th and 10th grade because it's such a critical skill, but also such a difficult one to learn, to give students a longer time and more exposure to really have that concrete before they move on.
Okay, thanks. Neil, you've been a critic of Common Core, and you've argued that ideally individual communities should set their own standards or be involved in setting those standards. The Hechinger report has spent some time in Louisiana where they set up review panels at the local level, and it was a mess. Many teachers and parents still felt locked out of the process. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think individual communities have to add when it comes to setting up standards?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is I'm much more a critic of the Common Core from the common part than the core part. I mean, that's not my area of expertise as in pedagogy, although I have some questions about the math in particular.
Someone can answer them, right?
But I thought your lesson was great, so I have no questions on that. But it's not even a matter really of local control. A lot of the problem with Common Core was it felt like it was imposed from really ultimately through the federal government. The federal government didn't create it. It's very important to understand that. But there were a lot of federal levers kind of pulled. And then what happened was most people were totally unaware of this until it hit their district and they were told, now implement these things. And they said, what are these? Where'd they come from? And that's where you start to see a lot of the YouTube videos and things like that. I think that what we've tried to do is sort of retroactively put a Band-Aid on that and said, okay, many states are going to re-examine these standards, and we're going to have some occasions where you can provide input as a parent, not realizing that most parents don't have time to read through all the standards. They're not going to understand all the standards. There's a lot of jargon. There's just a whole lot of indexing numbers that get confusing. And they said, so read it, tell us what you want to change, show up at these meetings. And again, that's not realistic. People with regular jobs who are trying to take care of their kids don't have time to read through all these standards, try and understand what the standards are. What I think people wanted was at least a state level or local debate where you could hear experts on both sides say, this is good, this is bad, this is what you should have, this is what you shouldn't, and we never had that. Ultimately, though, even at the community level, we have to understand that all kids are different. Communities may be have people who are more similar than if you go across an entire state, but all kids are different. That's the inherent problem with this sort of standardization, is it says everybody should basically be doing the same thing at the exact same rate, and anybody who's met more than one child knows that kids don't do the same things at the same rate, have the same skills, interests, or abilities. So we've got to get as far away from nationally standardized as we can get to individualized.
That segues somewhat into my next question, which is about achievement gaps, and that's something that we've looked at and found, especially in early adopter states in New York and Kentucky, that you've had achievement gaps that have stayed the same or gotten worse for disadvantaged kids. And I wanted to ask Liana, at your own school, which is mostly Hispanic, mostly low income, kids are still struggling to meet proficiency too. And why do you think these gaps aren't closing under Common Core?
I think it's also important to note that because we have new standards, we also have new assessments of those standards. So they're meant to match the new standards. And so I think there is a lot to work on. And I think, quite frankly, the standards were not necessarily rolled out in the most meaningful way. But that being said, in my first year teaching the Common Core standards, it was, here's the standards, go teach them. But with that being said, now several years into it, and now that we've been able to deeply go into the standards, I've seen growth in my students that I've never seen before. And this passion, and I'm a math teacher this year, but I've seen such a passion in students in their math learning and getting excited to defend their own answers, to critique each other's reasoning. And so along with the standards, there's also a set of sort of practices that go with the standards. In math, they're called the mathematical standards of practice that really guide some of the framework for teaching. And I think that has really allowed students to excel. I think in my school with a heavy English language learner population, it's more on the teachers to make sure that we're making each of those parts accessible for students so that they're able to do the math, that they're able to understand the math, and they're able to apply it in different circumstances. Can be very language heavy. And so it does create a need for teachers to really be thoughtful in how they're implementing the standards, but I think by and large, it's created students that are excited to talk about their own learning and passionate about it.
Kimberley, talk a little bit about New Jersey, which is another of the states that has seen achievement gaps stay stagnant under Common Core. What do states need to be doing to tackle these persistent gaps?
Yeah, I think it's multifaceted. Obviously, there is no one solution to a problem, and we need all of us to come together in our thinking with our different viewpoints in order for us to really think about the whole child. And I think, as Liana said, really thinking about implementation, first of all, that takes time, but that is the foundation for real change and sustainable change to take place on, and that takes place, excuse me, across time. I think that the other piece, though, that we need to be mindful of is that it is not just about the academics of why we see achievement gaps. And so in New Jersey, we're working very hard at the State Department, across departments, but also with our organizations and associations in our state who serve our children, whether it's an after-school program, our faith-based programs, places that provide supports for parents and children, coming together so that we can all get our arms around children and supporting them as they move through their educational journey, because sometimes there are barriers to their ability to learn that are in place because of their environment or their surroundings. And so we really need to be looking at all angles in order to really get at those gaps.
Neil, I don't know if you want to respond to any of why we've seen these gaps, if it's the Common Core's fault that the gaps have stayed persistent.
Yeah, it's not the Common Core's fault. I think we would be misleading ourselves if we thought the standards would change achievement gaps. So if kids aren't getting over a bar now, raising the bar, moving it to the right, moving it to the left, isn't going to do what's necessary to lift those kids over the bar. Something else has to happen than just say, well, we set really high standards now, we can just expect that kids will get over it, and suddenly they'll also get over it at the same rate, unless the bar is so low as to be meaningless. So I think people tend to attach a lot of great expectations to Common Core and standards, and it's not things they can deliver. A lot of this has to happen with each individual child, and a lot of that means you've got to be able to get an individual child into the environment that's best for them. That means, again, away from one sort of single model for everyone. That really means ultimately educational choice, where you can have schools that specialize in the needs of unique subsets of kids, or that teach things that subsets of kids are really interested in, and then you move them into those schools that are really best for them. And hopefully we're not even looking at that in terms of, well, we only care about you based on your race or your English language status. We say every individual child is all sorts of different things, and we want each child to get what's best for them.
Mm-hmm. One of the ironies that we found when we've been reporting on Common Core is that curriculum materials actually may be less centralized now than they used to be, when everybody used basically the same textbooks in every classroom across the U.S. Now there's been research showing that a lot more teachers are using their own curriculum, a lot more districts are creating their own curriculum. First, Liana, I want to ask you, because you're here in D.C. where they did make their own curriculum, how has that worked, and what do you think about it?
So in DC, they developed a curriculum for English language arts, and I can speak to specifically the elementary level. And so DC has its own curriculum for that, and I think it's an important balance between giving the teachers what they need to be successful and structuring that time for students, but also allowing teachers to have their own, take their own time to craft. Teaching is an art, and so allowing them a little bit of space to do what's best for their students. I would say with math, DC doesn't have its own curriculum. With the Common Core, other states have been developing their curriculums, and so we've actually been able to take the curriculum they use in New York and apply it in some of our schools here, not in all of the schools, but the school that I'm at actually uses New York's math curriculum. And so because of the Common Core, the work that teachers do on their own is now something that's more easily shared between other teachers because it's aligned.
Mm-hmm. Neil, do you think this is a positive shift? I mean, an unlooked for shift that actually do have a lot more local action around curriculum happening under Common Core?
Yeah, I don't think we have enough information to know. I mean, you'd want to see how this plays out over many years. I do think that one of the reasons you may have everybody kind of coming up with their own curriculum is because of the implementation problems, which was suddenly people were confronted with that said, oh, by the way, you're going to put in these new standards and teach to them, and people kind of had to scramble. That said, even if it was something where people were kind of rushing to put something together, textbooks don't enjoy the greatest reputation in terms of their quality, how engaging they are, and so it may be good to move away from those textbooks. On the flip side, maybe some people they could be useful guides for some teachers. So I don't think we really know right now, and we probably won't know for several years, and after good random assignment research and stuff like that's been done, whether or not it's been more effective to move away from textbooks and have individualized plans or not. And even if we keep individualized plans, or everyone goes with the engaged New York standards.
All right, we're going to do a quick lightning round about the future of Common Core. I have a different question for each of you. Neil, you've argued that Common Core is losing. So what do you think the political landscape will be for the standards 5 years from now? Will we still even be talking about it?
I don't think we'll be talking about it in that there'll be very few states, I suspect, who still call their standards Common Core because that name has been so poisoned. But I think you'll find, like New Jersey and many other states have found, that The standards you have are largely similar to Common Core, but even before Common Core, there was a lot of similarity between standards. I think what we'll see that's more substantive is very few states will be using the same tests. We've seen lots of states leave PARCC. New Jersey is still in PARCC, but most states have left that were in it. And even the SBAC, the other major test, has had a lot of states leave. So I think you'll see less commonality actually among tests than the standards.
Is that, Kimberley, something that will be lost, moving away from the commonness of the Common Core? We won't be able to compare states in the same way.
I don't think so. I mean, in New Jersey, we are continuing with the PARCC assessment. We found that it really has been good for our students. We feel like it's moving in the right direction of what they're going to face in terms of when they take their SATs and other tests that are going to be online and a different sort of engagement than, again, we remember from when we were students where it was memorizing an enormous volume of vocabulary. But in New Jersey, having gone through a revision of our standards, anytime we revise our standards, we look at our assessment and go through an assessment audit because obviously we need an assessment that's aligned to the standards. We believe that the revisions in the standards still keep us aligned with the evidence statements, but we're in the process of determining that.
And then start thinking about your own questions. I'm going to put one more to Liana, and then we'll take questions from the audience. If we rolled back Common Core in DC tomorrow, unlikely, but would things change? What would change in the classrooms and what wouldn't change?
I think as an educator, I want the best standards for my students. I want my students achieving at the highest levels possible, regardless of where they're coming in, the highest levels for them. And so I think if the Common Core went away tomorrow, there are a lot of practices and there are a lot of instructional practices that would stick around. A commonality in both ELA and in math, so in reading and in math, is that idea of being able to defend your work. So in reading, it's pulling out evidence and using text-based arguments, and in math, it's being able to explain your reasoning and defend your reasoning, and I think those conversations with students in that framework of teaching will stick around.
Mm-hmm. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
My name is Asia Palmer, and I'm from DC. I've had a question for a while now, so this may be very muddled or puzzling, but something that I wanted to speak upon was that the most talked about thing is about early childhood education, and even though that is important and also very vital to a child learning later on, I think it's also important to speak about how in early childhood education there's a lot of colorful things, there's a lot of things around them that they pay attention to, and when you get to high school, it's more pay attention to the teacher. And that big change in difference causes more distractions, and it causes people to pay more attention to the things around them. So I think that should be more thought about than rather this, what the children are thinking or if they're actually bored, because I do believe children are very engaged in what they're learning.
Let me put that to Liana. Have you seen a change in just the pedagogy? I mean, you talked about that a little bit, but what has changed in the way teachers are running classrooms?
I think it has created more space for students to come to some learning on their own. So it has created, especially at the elementary level and through 5th grade, where the teacher is not necessarily standing in the front of the class talking to the students and telling the students what to do, but more students are standing in front of each other or working together to work on problems on their own, and the teacher is guiding that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you so much for bringing voice to such an important issue. It is something people often ask me what keeps me up at night. It's intermediate and secondary education. I feel like we are not engaging students, and it means we think because they've moved beyond the early childhood years that they don't want to be invited into the educational conversation and space, and that they don't have wonderful ideas and need to be engaged in many of the similar ways. And in New Jersey, that is actually leading my work at the State Department right now with educators in our state around how we look at authentic, individualized, personalized instruction at the intermediate and secondary education so that we really can really shape and change what education looks like for older students. Thank you for raising that.
Do we have other questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nancy Goodman from Insight Advance. Neil, you talked about how regardless of the standards, it's about personalizing the instruction to the student, and that hit my teacher nerve. And so thinking about, Liana, your work as the interpreter of the standards to the student, my question is, regardless of the standards, we know the bar is high, we want a high bar for our kids. So how do we support the teachers in that interpretation, in taking those standards and getting them to meeting the kids where they are?
I think that was to you.
Yeah, okay.
Because I have no good answer on it.
I think that's a challenge regardless of what the standards are, and I think that's why the first few years of the Common Core standards, it was a challenge because not only are teachers figuring out how to interpret the standards for themselves and what that means for their teaching, but then they have a class of students that they have to figure out how to best meet the needs of every single one of those students. And so I think part of it is a little bit of time and making sure that districts are providing the space and the time for teachers to really dig into the standards, understand them, and then be able to look at their student roster and figure out for each unit, how am I going to teach this for the students in my classroom this year? And I think it takes a lot of time.
Thank you. And that's all. Thank you so much for coming here today and talking about that.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.